You're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Matt Berkman. Our guest today is Wesley Clark, the retired four-star general who commanded NATO forces during the war in Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. In 2004, he ran for president in the Democratic primary before ultimately losing out to Senator John Kerry. More recently, Clark helped launch Renew America Together, an organization dedicated to overcoming partisan polarization and gridlock. General Clark, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. It's good to be with you at the Mitchell Center.
We're very grateful you were able to join us. So tell us about your Renew America Together initiative.
So we started looking at this problem of the split between Republicans and Democrats. It became so painful by 2018. We figured what could we do about this? So we worked to form a non-governmental organization, a 501c3 charitable activity that could bring, I was seeking post-partisan politics as though, retired military guys, when they get out and they sometimes give lectures and other things, they talk about the military and they explain it to people. I was thinking we could find people who've been in active political life and we could bring them out and present from both the Republican and Democratic side. We could present to the American people the inside story of why American politics works, why both parties understand that they're pulling toward the extremes and that they're really competing for the center, and why they pick particular issues and why money matters and what the alternatives are if you want a different kind of politics. I thought we could get post-partisan Democrats and Republicans together to explore these ideas. But unlike the military, it's hard to find people who are truly post-partisan, even when they're out of elective office. But we've had some great conversations with business groups, World Affairs Councils, universities. But like everything, it's about politics is about the heart. It's about what people feel. And they take the facts and they work them into their belief structures. And if the facts don't support their beliefs, sometimes they don't hear the facts. We know that about politics. And it's more so today than it ever was, but I think it's very constructive to try to have people who've been in the arena talk about it, stand back and reflect on it, to try to bring those reflections to the American people.
What's the most interesting thing that you've heard in the course of those conversations?
There are a lot of things. It's about money and organizations and how people in office trade off the decision-making versus the politics of it, how they try to keep their professional ethics and standards high, even though there are conflicts that are obviously there. But we found some really great insights from people like Tom Ridge, former governor of Pennsylvania, who shared one of the sessions with me. Andrew Card, former Secretary of Transportation and Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush, have been on. Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas, won the Iowa presidential primary, still out there fighting and talking about fake news and how he sees it. These are insights that draw the audience in and give the audience a little behind the scenes look from people who know the experience, but we're not asking for votes, we're not asking for money from the audience. So it changes the tenor of the conversation.
And what do you think have been the underlying drivers of this extreme partisan polarization that we experience today?
It's about the struggle for power and influence. And both parties it's the way American society works, not just for political parties, but for any non-governmental organization. You have to have an issue. You have to be distinguished on that issue. And you have to then attract money and support. So in American politics, the issues are out there. The Democratic Party's been a party that stood up for labor since the turn of the 20th century, really in the beginnings of the progressive movement. When Woodrow Wilson took the issues away from the Republicans under Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, the Democratic Party became progressive. And it started a cycle in American politics that really didn't end until maybe 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected, and building on the work of Goldwater and Nixon and others, Reagan created a new set of issues. It was no taxes or lower taxes. It was less government. It was strong national security. Whereas the Democrats were in favor of, as he explained it, a bloated government and a weak national security and giving away money and unions that were corrupt. And so these became the cleavage issues. And underlying that was what Nixon pioneered as the Southern strategy based on the dog whistles, the secret appeal to white fears and racism in the South as bit by bit the Republican Party moved to take over the old Democratic strongholds of the South. So there was that. There was the guns issue that surfaced as pushed by American gun manufacturers, and it can be a profitable business. The National Rifle Association became more and more political. When my father was a member of the National Rifle Association, it was about being able to, go hunting. It was about the best telescopic rifle to shoot an elk at 500 meters. But it's no longer about that. And so these issues, as they've emerged, the issue of a woman's right to choose versus pro-life, these are issues that political parties sign on to, they grasp because they mobilize emotion. And emotion brings commitment, it brings money. It's like that famous Charlton Heston, the great 1950s, 60s actor, said, standing before the NRA convention, he says, "You'll take my rifle from my cold, dead hands." I mean, it was such a huge emotional statement at the time. It brought millions and millions of dollars in to the National Rifle Association, which was funneled to the Republican Party, which then worked strongly to overturn the ban on the assault weapons and has succeeded in enforcing these Second Amendment issues. It's the quest. Look, America is the most powerful country in the world, and there are two groups contending, and they have somewhat different approaches and philosophies, but the differences in approaches tend to be exaggerated in the sense that they have to appeal to their base. They have to motivate the emotions of their followers to get out and vote and bring in money. And of course, the more money that comes into politics, the harder you have to work to appeal to the constituencies that have that money. So it's the competition is the engine that drives American politics and drives the split between the parties.
So you think that this period of partisan polarization is kind of just a natural outcome of the dynamics of the American democratic system? Because, we did have a period prior to this from roughly the New Deal to the 80s where there was, relative consensus between the parties. Eisenhower wasn't all that different from Truman. And then things kind of went awry more recently. So, do you see this as being the prelude to another period of consensus in the future?
It could be, but if you look at the broad sweep of American politics since the American Civil War, we've gone through three major eras in American politics. It's like a pendulum that swings from one side to the other, and it is painfully, with great difficulty, perhaps self-correcting. And that's why we believe in democracy as the best form of government. So you come out of the Civil War in the United States, you become industrialized, you're the most powerful country in the world, the world's greatest producer of iron and steel at the turn of the 20th century. We got fat on European investments, and they came here because we had the largest integrated market in the world. They loved it. And then we did that on the backs of a lot of immigrant labor. And so the labor movement got stronger and stronger. People looked at the exploitation of labor in slaughterhouses. They looked at the exploitation of mines and steel plants, labor unionized. And there were concerns about communism and socialism and foreign influences, and the police were called out and there were riots. But World War I required a huge mobilization of labor. And we brought women into the workforce at that point. And then Roosevelt in the 1930s seized on the ideas of the progressive movement, among other ideas, to try to bring the country out of the Depression. And we went through World War II on that. It took an adversarial group to create contrasting ideas. So Milton Friedman and monetarist theory, which said, stop the fiscal spending that marked Keynes and deficit spending. You can control it through the money supply. So we went backwards, really, from Keynesianism to what could be called neoliberal today, neoliberal economics, back to the old supply and demand system in the market for goods and services, and trying to reduce the role of government in the economy. And then there was the clash of the efforts to create a social safety net. Well, there was some overlapping. There were some fights in Congress. There were jurisdictions from one subcommittee to another subcommittee that were contentious and so forth. And so when I was in the Office of Management and Budget in the mid-'70s, we worked on what we called mess charts that showed how mixed up all these social welfare programs were and how they ought to be straightened out. And of course, the subtext to it was a lot of wasted money there. And so this built the platform for Reagan to come in. And we're now in this third era of Ronald Reagan, of cutting back on government, of not trusting government, of believing in federalism, of saying the solution to your problems lies at your front door, not in Washington. Somehow that's gone so far in terms of guns, tax cutting, the lack of infrastructure, the inability to coordinate a pandemic strategy. All of these things are reflections of the era of Reagan. And so you can feel with the rise of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and the far, what's called the far left in the Democratic Party, you can see the pendulum building momentum and getting ready to swing back. Now, will it swing back in 2020, 2024, 2028? Don't know. But given the incredible inequalities of wealth and income that have emerged in America, we're back to where we were in the Gilded Age. And that's what sort of sparked all the progressive movement in the first place over 100 years ago. So you can feel that pressure building. And this is, in a democracy, these pressures lead to self-correction of excess. We just have to hang on to that democracy, follow the laws, follow the rules, have some understanding of why we're feeling the way we're feeling, and try to work our way through these challenges. Politics is the way that money and power and influence are distributed in the country. And so it's naturally contentious.
Well, that's a great segue to the next question, which was, do you believe that Donald Trump poses a serious threat to the norms and institutions of American democracy?
Well, he's certainly a man who doesn't show a lot of respect for the institutions and norms of American democracy. And of course, I ran for president as a Democrat. I mostly voted Republican as an Army officer because I was a believer in national security. And the reason I ran for office was because I knew the war in Iraq was going to be a fiasco, and it turned out pretty ugly. And so I've seen both sides of the politics of it. I've been in Washington a lot. I'm now living in a red state. But we've never seen anything like Donald Trump and what he's trying to do to American institutions. It's a disrespect for the law. You could see it from the beginning, really, when he stood on the platform and said, I'm the only one that has an answer to anything when he was nominated. But the bullying of the Federal Reserve chief, that was shocking. The firing of the FBI director, that was shocking. The effort to bend Congress to his will and now doing away with, we're not worrying about Congress so much with the effort to assist the people who've been so damaged financially by the pandemic. I mean, all of these are indicators. He wants to break free. Now, whether it's intentional or whether it's just like, hey, I spent my life running my own business and I know best about everything. And all these people are just hired help and I don't respect them. Whatever it is, he has an authoritarian impulse, which, if not checked, is eroding the foundations of our liberties, freedoms, our very rule of law in the United States.
So Trump has refused to say that he'd accept the results of November's presidential elections, especially if the results hinged on mail-in ballots. He's been doing a lot to try to discredit mail-in balloting. Just yesterday, the website Defense One published an open letter from two former Army officers directed at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, urging them to remove Trump from office in the event that he does refuse to take his leave once an election has been certified in Joe Biden's favor. So I'm wondering, what is your take on the possibility of such a scenario? What do you think the military should do if it plays out like that?
Well, I think the military would do what it must do at that point, but and there is discussion about it. But I think that we're a long way from that. There's a senator from Iowa who won election with this famous phrase. She was a hog farmer, and I guess she was referring to something to do with the hogs, but she said, "Make them squeal." Well, Trump supporters listen to what he says about this, and they like it. It's like, I'm going to make those liberal media people squeal about this. I mean, look at it. He's really got them upset. They're so upset, and they like that. Trump plays to his base like this, and it's a distraction. Would he really want to stay in office? Can't say, don't know. Nancy Pelosi says, absolutely not. He's not going to stay. And I'm sure there'd be an outcry. But you know what's more worrisome than those bold situations is the ambiguity that could come as a result of the election, with ballots not counted, state electors not picked and certified, confusion about whether or not the reporting period for counting the votes could be extended and who would have the authority to do it, and ultimately the invocation of the Supreme Court. Last time that happened was 20 years ago. A lot of people were pretty unhappy about it, because if you actually looked at the facts with the so-called hanging Chad, and many of the people watching this don't remember it, but I remember it all too clearly. So a lot of votes weren't counted. There were punch holes in the ballots, and the question was, okay, if the hole is punched, but it didn't count electronically because the little flap was still hanging there, and does that mean it's a yes or a no, or was it an accident? And they went through this, and the time was running out. Finally, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, that's enough. We're not recounting every ballot in Florida, but maybe they should have, because a lot of Democrats believe that if they recounted every ballot in Florida, the outcome of that election would have been different. And there's no question, Matt, that who's president in the United States makes a big difference.
I think that's something that we're all definitely feeling now. So you've expressed concern in the past that under Trump, the U.S. is moving away from what you call a rules-based international order. Could you describe how that order functioned before Trump was elected, and how it has changed since 2017?
So at the end of the Second World War, the United States, working with our allies, created a number of international institutions with operating rules. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank. There was a Bretton Woods agreement on currency and how to maintain the value of respective currencies. And it was done in an effort to prevent the emergence of an international system that was just dominated by might makes right. They tried to rationally think through how things should be run, and then set up a structure in which decisions could be anticipated, planned for, followed an orderly process so that nations could work through that and move ahead. And this was complemented by our alliance structure. We formed NATO in 1949 to try to resist the Soviet threats on Western Europe. and other alliances. And over the years, these agreements became realized. And with the end of the Cold War, then the United States became the predominant superpower, the only superpower remaining in the world. It might have seemed to other people, like people in China or Vladimir Putin, that they were going to have to live under the dominance of the United States forever. And in the 1990s, they began to work against it privately, but more openly in the aughts. And by now we see we're in an era where we're contending with multipolarity. And that, coupled with a president who doesn't respect, understand, study the issues, or appreciate the foundation that's been laid for him by his predecessors in terms of using these international institutions and the rules that they project to protect the interests of the American people, we're moving into uncharted territory where the whim of the president can decide the fate of nations. That's what we don't want. We want structure, deliberation, expertise. We want allies. We want to restrain the worst, angriest, most impulsive ideas, smother them under a blanket of analysis, and move step by step, help mankind deal with the big issues that are confronting us, like climate change, like a global pandemic, and other things. What we don't want is a private conversation unrecorded between the head of a potential adversary and our president to decide the course of mankind. That's what in many, many previous centuries led to war.
So acknowledging the necessity of an international order, an international law of the type that you are describing, I imagine that many people might argue or point out that the United States has consistently taken unilateral measures that infringe on the sovereignty of other countries or violate international law in one way or another, whether we're talking about CIA-backed coups during the Cold War or a more recent war in Iraq and the global war on terror today with things like extraordinary rendition and black sites. So, my question is, how does that square with the idea of a rules-based international order? And do you think that, other countries might say, well, the U.S., the supposed leader of the international order only obeys it inconsistently, violates it with impunity, so why should we follow it?
Yeah, it's a good rationale. Look, it's many of these are regrettable exceptions. The United States is not blameless in its conduct, and it has made mistakes. I'd argue fewer mistakes than other countries have made, but we've made mistakes, and that continues down to the present day in terms of things like the rendition policies, torture, violation of the International Convention Against Torture, which we signed, refusal to sign the Law of the Sea Treaty, or support the International Criminal Court. All these institutions work for America's interest, because when you establish the rules of the road, then people can plan. We're a democracy. We don't have a central authoritarian leader who says, do this, do that, do this, do that. You have distributed efforts by hundreds and thousands of businesses and organizations. They need those rules. That's what's made America great, and that's what we don't want to give up on.
The U.S. recently became a net exporter of petroleum products, and we're close, but not quite there, but we're close to energy independence. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that U.S. military engagements in the Middle East have been driven by the concern to secure oil supplies? And do you predict that we'll see fewer interventions in that region once the U.S. is fully oil independent?
Well, we're starting in the 1970s, when the United States became an oil importing nation, the value of Middle East petroleum became larger and larger. And at about the same time, Britain completed its withdrawal from the region. It used to be Britain that was the peacekeeper in the Persian Gulf, and Britain moved back in the late 60s. And so the region needed help. We were always concerned about a Soviet incursion into Iran. So we had a two pillars policy. The Shah of Iran was a friend, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was our other ally. They weren't the best of friends, those two, but we balanced it off between them. And then as a consequence of all this, the price of oil rose, and then it became even more, as the economies grew, the region became even more important to the United States. But we're bound to the region regardless of energy. We have a deep personal commitment to the state of Israel and its survival. And it is still under extraordinary threat from Iran and from other elements in the region. And so we're not going to leave the region. Those oil resources may not be as important to us today, but they're critically important to Europe. And without Europe, we don't have the kind of counterbalance to China that's necessary to be able to help China observe the rules of the road in a rules-based international order. So we're going to still be engaged in the region. We can't leave it.
Well, it doesn't make it into the media, or at least the mainstream media very often, but there's a concern out there by some on the left that, in criticizing Donald Trump for not being tough enough on Russia and Vladimir Putin, that the Democratic Party establishment and also its allies in the media are kind of setting the country up on a trajectory for a new Cold War with Russia that could potentially lead to unnecessary military confrontation somewhere down the line. Do you think that that's a genuine possibility and a concern?
Well, I think that's entirely up to Mr. Putin. He's the one who sought the confrontation. Look, this goes back to the 1990s, really. When the Soviet Union collapsed, some in the United States were naive. They thought it would just become democratic. But in fact, inside the Soviet Union, the intelligence apparatus always had a plan for this. So they took the money, they moved the money to the West. They took their KGB operatives, they trained many of them to run for office. So that in the first set of elections in Russia, 3/4 of the candidates were former members or current members of the intelligence apparatus in the Soviet Union. So democracy, real democracy, Western-style democracy, it never had a chance in Russia. And we didn't do anything really to help it other than maintain good relations at the top and send some Chicago School of Economics free market guys in to give advice. And so the same people who lost the Cold War, who were ideologically committed against the West, resurfaced. By 1998, then Russian Premier Yevgeny Primakov was speaking at NATO. He said, Russia, we have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. In other words, Russia wasn't going to be a permanent friend of the West. The idea that you could have one Europe, the Atlantic to the Urals, Primakov wasn't buying it. He wanted Russia to be in opposition. And this Primakov doctrine then was the basis on which Vladimir Putin became first the prime minister and then the president. And over the years, it's unfolded as he has strengthened his internal control of Russia. He's now able to use that control to project power and resistance outward. So starting in really 2008 with his war against Georgia, which basically was a setup by Russia to provoke conflict and demonstrate Russian power. He's moved step by step to try to regain control of what the Russians would call their Soviet space. It's like one of the Russian generals told me when I was in Moscow over 20 years ago. He said, these Eastern European countries, they're ours. Really? I mean, that's not what we believe. We don't believe in spheres of influence. We believe that nations should cooperate and work together for the best interest of everybody. But that's not what's underlying Russia's policy. So I think that for the theoreticians, for the people on the left who are worried about a new Cold War, need to focus it on Russia and what is Russia doing rather than what is America doing in response. Because really, if you don't resist these expansionist tendencies, they will unravel the structure of peace that's maintained stability around the world, and particularly in Europe, for 70 years. So there's no real alternative to resistance, but you have to direct the concern and the fury outward to the source of the problem. It wasn't that NATO ever had any means or any inclination to attack the Soviet Union or, after its demise, Russia. But it's Russia which projects NATO as a threat. To give you an example, in the late 1990s, I remember being in Bulgaria before Bulgaria was a member of NATO. And the Bulgarian foreign minister came to me and she said, "General, Bulgaria must become a member of NATO." I said, but why? She said, "Because today Russia is weak, but someday Russia will be strong again. And before then, we must be in NATO." Why? Because they didn't want to be one of Russia's countries. They didn't want to be owned and dominated by Russia, because that's the way it had been for more than a century. So this is what's motivated the need for structure and security for the EU and for NATO to work on. And so we need our people in the United States to understand the dynamics of the tension and to put the focus on the source of the tension rather than the necessary response to it.
You were Supreme Allied Commander Europe during NATO's military intervention in the former Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. The most recent NATO intervention, as you know, was the one in Libya in 2011 under President Obama. That operation was authorized by the United Nations, in the name of protecting civilians from Muammar Gaddafi. But 9 years later, you look at the country, and it's still embroiled in a civil war that was kind of touched off by the intervention. It's produced a humanitarian crisis, ongoing crisis of refugees and internally displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. And Libya has also become a kind of hub for human traffickers. So, my question is, what is your view on the wisdom of the Libya intervention? And even when military missions of this sort are authorized by the United Nations, when is it wise to pursue them, and when is it not?
Well, you have to meet a certain set of conditions to be able to work with something like that. You need a coalition, you need international legitimacy, certainly. You need the military power to be successful, but you also must know what happens after the conflict. The reason our intervention in Kosovo was successful is because we had a post-conflict plan. In the case of Libya, at least so far as I know, there was no real post-conflict plan. It was get rid of Gaddafi, but then what? And there wasn't a single structure. There wasn't a single leader. There wasn't a consensus. Libya was a nation of contending tribes who were prepared to fight each other in the absence of a strong centralized authority. Once you got rid of Gaddafi, the fighting began. And different nations came in and supported different factions or tribes, depending on what their interest was. So all that could have been foreseen. It could have been worked. I know the people that made those decisions made them on the basis at the time it looked like an urgent humanitarian issue. But it turned out not to be an urgent humanitarian issue at all in relation to the consequences of the action. So you have to be able to think backwards through a contingency like this. You start your thought with what the end state is, what's going to be achieved by the intervention, and then you work from the back forward to how would you do it, who would support it, is it legitimate, how could it be made legitimate, and then you reach your decision on whether or not it's a good idea to do it. You don't start with gee, we got to do something really quick here with the military because they're the only people that can do anything. That's usually a recipe for disaster.
What kind of foreign policy would you expect from a Biden-Harris administration?
Well, I think you get a big effort to once again reset relations with Russia, but at the same time maintain a strong NATO. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's always important to try to talk to the people you don't agree with. You don't shut them out and shut them down. I think you see an effort to restore the arrangement with Iran that was going to put the brakes on the Iranian nuclear program. But I think you'd see it was toughened up to try to work against Iran's support of terrorism abroad. I think you'd see a restructuring of our or re-intensification of our work with our Pacific allies, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Indonesia, perhaps, certainly Korea and Japan, the Philippines, because we recognize that China has become increasingly assertive, and it has to be met with a mixture of engagement, economic cooperation and interdependence, but also firmness in terms of insisting on its adherence to international law and the international order that's been created.
I'll just conclude with one final question that is about domestic politics, but it has a military angle. The country is currently having a national debate about whether various monuments to Confederate or otherwise slave-holding American leaders should be removed. And according to the New York Times, there are at least 10 U.S. military installations across the South that are named for Confederate Army officers. Do you think those installations should be renamed, and how would that get done? What's the process for doing that?
Well, yes, they should be renamed. And what's stopping it is simply the politics of Mr. Trump and the presidential election. When those names were put in place, there was a different political structure in the South. And there was an historic resistance, actually, of bringing federal troops back into the South because there was a legacy of these troops' presence during Reconstruction that a lot of white Southerners didn't like. And so in an effort to appease the construction of these posts, camp, and stations during the First World War and then the Second World War, they were given names that were supposedly more amenable to people in the South. That is the names of these defeated Confederate generals. Time to put that chapter of American history to rest. It's okay to study the exploits of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson in a military history course, the same way you study the battles of the Japanese Navy or the German campaign on the Eastern Front in World War II. That's historical fact, and we should learn from history. But it's another thing to extol these men through monuments and through naming military installations after them. That's going 2 steps beyond where we need to be. American society, everybody in America needs to be appreciated. Our strength has been in diversity, and we've got to celebrate that diversity and bring this country together.
General Wesley Clark, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
All right. Thank you.